Alessio, what if one man created the weapon that changed the world forever? Discover the shocking true story, hidden facts, and powerful ending behind Oppenheimer 2023. Watch till the end only on Filmy Review Hub because this movie is far deeper than you think. Please rewrite this into simple and easy wording. Also, remove the citations number from this and write it in USA slang language. Note, do not short the length of this. Oppenheimer is a 2023 epic biographical thriller film written, co-produced, and directed by Christopher Nolan. 6. It follows the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the American theoretical physicist who helped develop the first nuclear weapons during World War II, based on the 2005 biography American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. The film dramatizes Oppenheimer's studies, his direction of the Los Alamos laboratory, and his 1954 security hearing. Cillian Murphy stars as Oppenheimer alongside Robert Downey Jr. as the United States Atomic Energy Commission member Louis Strauss. The ensemble supporting cast includes Emily Blunt, Matt Damon, Florence Pugh, Josh Hartnett, Casey Affleck, Rami Malek, and Kenneth Branagh. Oppenheimer was announced in September 2021. It was Nolan's first film not distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures since Memento 2000 due to his conflicts regarding the studio's simultaneous theatrical and HBO Max release schedule. Murphy was the first cast member to join, with the rest joining between November 2021 and April 2022. Pre-production began by January 2022 and filming took place from February to May. The cinematographer, Hoyt van Hoytema, used a combination of IMAX 65mm and 65mm large format film, including for the first time selected scenes in IMAX black and white film photography. As with many of his previous films, Nolan used extensive practical effects and claimed minimal use of compositing. Despite these claims, the final film contained several hundred VFX shots, 8 made by a mostly uncredited VFX crew of around 160. 9. Oppenheimer premiered at Le Grand Rex in Paris on Tuesday, July 11, 2023, and was theatrically released in the United States and the United Kingdom on July 21 by Universal Pictures. Its concurrent release with Warner Brothers. As Barbie was the catalyst of the Barbenheimer phenomenon, encouraging audiences to see both films as a double feature. Oppenheimer received widespread critical acclaim and grossed over $976 million worldwide, becoming the third highest grossing film of 2023. It was the highest grossing biographical film of all time until being overtaken by Michael in 2026. The recipient of many accolades, Oppenheimer was nominated for 13 awards at the 96th Academy Awards and won 7, including Best Picture, Best Director, Nolan, Best Actor, Murphy, and Best Supporting Actor, Downey. It also won 5 Golden Globe Awards, including Best Motion Picture, Drama, and 7 British Academy Film Awards, including Best Film, and was named one of the top 10 films of 2023 by the National Board of Review and the American Film Institute. Casting in 1945, the first atomic bomb is successfully tested, a triumph for J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. After the test, political leaders take the decision about using the weapon out of the scientist's hands. President Harry S. Truman orders the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer had urged Truman to brief Stalin beforehand. Truman refuses. Oppenheimer later comes to believe that this secrecy helped trigger the nuclear arms race. Though publicly celebrated, Oppenheimer is deeply haunted by the destruction and loss of life. When he meets Truman and expresses his personal sense of guilt, the president berates him, insisting that the responsibility for the decision was his alone. Oppenheimer's subsequent calls to limit further nuclear weapons development are dismissed. After the war, Rear Admiral Louis Strauss, a high-ranking member of the newly formed U.S. Atomic Energy Commission (AEC), recruits Oppenheimer as a scientific advisor. In that role, Oppenheimer becomes increasingly controversial. He argues that a hydrogen bomb presents enormous technical difficulties and should not be pursued, instead urging international control of nuclear weapons to prevent their spread. Meanwhile, Edward Teller's advocacy for the super gains traction amid the intensifying Cold War. Strauss grows to resent Oppenheimer. He believes Oppenheimer publicly humiliated him by dismissing concerns about exporting radioisotopes and by recommending negotiations with the Soviet Union after the Soviets detonate their own atomic bomb. Oppenheimer had suggested mutual restraint on the hydrogen bomb, warning that an American program would force the Soviets to follow suit. Despite Oppenheimer's objections, Truman authorizes the H bomb effort. Strauss also becomes convinced that Oppenheimer had somehow aided the Soviets during the Manhattan Project, and that a 1947 conversation between Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein had been an occasion for Oppenheimer to denigrate him. In 1954, determined to destroy Oppenheimer's political influence, Strauss secretly engineers a closed door security hearing before an AEC Personal Security Board concerning Oppenheimer's Q clearance. The outcome is effectively predetermined. Although Strauss was SEC chairman, the formal charges are brought by William L. Borden, a fiercely anti-communist lawyer and executive director of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, who writes a letter to the FBI based on Oppenheimer's security file. Material Strauss is strongly implied to have facilitated Borden's access to. At the hearing, Oppenheimer's past associations with communists, including bringing his brother Frank, a known communist, onto the Manhattan Project, are used against him. Testimony from Leslie Groves and others is selectively twisted. Edward Teller states that he lacks confidence in Oppenheimer and recommends revocation of the clearance. Groves supports him. The proceeding is purely administrative, held in private, with no public hearing and no requirement that the government meet a burden of proof. Special counsel Roger Robb, appointed by Strauss, has full access to Oppenheimer's file, while Oppenheimer's own attorney does not. The board revokes the Q clearance, severely damaging Oppenheimer's public standing and ending his influence on nuclear policy. In 1959, during Strauss's Senate confirmation hearing for Secretary of Commerce, David Hill testifies about Strauss's personal motives in orchestrating Oppenheimer's downfall. The Senate rejects the nomination. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson presents Oppenheimer with the Enrico Fermi Award as a gesture of political rehabilitation. A final flashback reveals that the 1947 conversation with Einstein never mentioned Strauss. Instead, Oppenheimer had voiced his fear that they had started a chain reaction, a nuclear arms race that might one day destroy the world. The casting process for Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer centered on a deliberate effort to populate the screen with performers who could embody the intellectual intensity, moral complexity, and period-specific physicality of the historical figures surrounding J. Robert Oppenheimer. Casting director John Papsidera, a longtime collaborator of Nolan's dating back nearly 3 decades and responsible for assembling the ensembles of films including Memento, The Dark Knight, Inception, Interstellar, and Dunkirk, approached the project with two primary mandates. The first was to honor the real individuals by psyching actors whose faces, physics, and essences could approximate the scientists, military officers, politicians, and personal associates depicted in the source material. The Pulitzer Prize-winning biography American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. The second was to create a dense, interlocking ensemble capable of sustaining the film's nonlinear structure, which interweaves the development of the atomic bomb at Los Alamos with the 1954 security clearance hearing and the 1959 Senate confirmation hearings of Louis Strauss. Papsidera has described the process as beginning with the tentpole roles and then filling outward, always prioritizing historical resonance over pure star power. Even as the finished film ultimately featured an extraordinary concentration of recognizable talent, Cillian Murphy's selection as J. Robert Oppenheimer formed the foundation of the entire cast. Nolan has recounted that he deliberately avoided writing with any specific actor in mind, preferring instead to remain focused on the historical person. Yet after months of staring at the cover photograph of American Prometheus, Alfred Eisenstedt's portrait of Oppenheimer with his intense piercing gaze, Nolan found he could not separate the image from Murphy. The Irish actor had already appeared in 5 previous Nolan projects: Batman Begins, The Dark Knight Rises, Inception, and Dunkirk, always in supporting or secondary capacities. This time, Nolan contacted him directly and informed him that the role was his, that the screenplay had been written in the first person so that the audience would experience events through Oppenheimer's perspective, and that Murphy would carry the film. Murphy's physical preparation was extreme. He lost substantial weight to approximate Oppenheimer's gaunt, almost ethereal frame, adopting a diet so restricted that he later described surviving on minimal calories. The resemblance extended beyond body to the eyes. Critics and audiences repeatedly noted how Murphy's blue eyed intensity mirrored the historical photographs. Murphy has spoken of the psychological toll of inhabiting a man whose brilliance was inseparable from profound guilt and of the responsibility of portraying a figure who changed the course of human history. His performance required not only intellectual command of dense scientific dialogue, but also the ability to convey Oppenheimer's contradictions: charismatic teacher, reluctant administrator, adulterous husband, and ultimately haunted public figure across decades of the character's life. Emily Blunt was cast as Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer, the botanist and former Communist Party member who became Oppenheimer's wife. Blunt and Murphy had previously worked together on A Quiet Place Part 2, and that established trust proved useful for the intimate and often strained domestic scenes. Kitty is not a passive spouse, she is sharp tongued, alcoholic, intellectually formidable, and fiercely protective of her husband during the security hearing. Blunt's casting brought a performer known for both dramatic depth and an ability to project steely intelligence. The role demanded she convey the isolation of Los Alamos life, the frustrations of secondary status as a woman in a male dominated scientific community, and the complex loyalty of a partner who both enables and challenges Oppenheimer. Blunt has noted the collaborative atmosphere on set and the intensity of working opposite Murphy for extended sequences that required precise emotional calibration. Matt Damon returned to the Nolan fold after Interstellar to portray Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer who directed the Manhattan Project and selected Oppenheimer to lead the scientific effort at Los Alamos. Damon's casting provided a pragmatic, no-nonsense counterweight to Murphy's more ethereal Oppenheimer. Groves is a military man of action, bureaucratic skill, and occasional blunt humor. Damon captures the character's mixture of respect for scientific talent and impatience with academic pretension. The scenes between Damon and Murphy form one of the film's central relationships, an alliance of necessity that evolves into something approaching mutual understanding, then fractures under the pressures of post-war politics. Damon's physical presence and vocal authority help ground the sprawling narrative in the practical realities of large-scale military scientific collaboration. Robert Downey Jr. was chosen to play Louis Strauss, the Atomic Energy Commission figure whose personal and professional antagonism toward Oppenheimer drives much of the film's second half. Nolan has spoken of wanting an actor of Downey's caliber to disappear into a character far removed from the charismatic energy of Iron Man. Strauss is portrayed as a man of considerable intelligence and ambition whose insecurities and perceived slights lead him to orchestrate Oppenheimer's downfall. Downey's performance is deliberately restrained, relying on subtle shifts in posture, tone, and facial expression rather than overt theatricality. The black and white sequences that frame Strauss's Senate confirmation hearings allowed Downey to work in a different visual register, emphasizing the political machinations of the post-war era. Nolan has remarked that a generation of audiences familiar only with Downey's Marvel persona had never fully seen the range of which the actor is capable. Oppenheimer provided that opportunity. The casting also created a productive tension. Two of the most recognizable faces in contemporary cinema, Murphy and Downey, were asked to subordinate star persona to historical characterization. Florence Pugh took on the role of Jean Tatlock, the psychiatrist, Communist Party member, and Oppenheimer's lover, whose relationship with him becomes a focal point of both personal drama and later security investigations. Pugh's scenes are fewer than those of the principal quartet, yet they carry significant emotional and thematic weight. Tatlock is depicted as intellectually vibrant, politically committed, and ultimately tragic. Pugh's casting brought a performer capable of conveying both sensuality and ideological conviction, and of making the brief, intense encounters with Murphy feel consequential rather than merely scandalous. The role required navigating the sensitive historical questions surrounding Tatlock's death and the extent of government surveillance of Oppenheimer's personal life. Josh Hartnett was cast as Ernest Lawrence, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and inventor of the cyclotron, who worked closely with Oppenheimer at Berkeley and later at Los Alamos. Hartnett's return to a major studio film after a period of lower profile work generated considerable attention. Nolan and Papsidera viewed Lawrence as something of a movie star in real life, charismatic, ambitious, and politically more cautious than Oppenheimer. Hartnett's performance captures that mixture of scientific brilliance and institutional pragmatism. The casting of a once prominent leading man in a supporting scientific role underscored the film's strategy of filling even secondary parts with actors of considerable presence. Casey Affleck appears as Boris Pash, the military intelligence officer who investigated Oppenheimer's associations and confronted him about potential security risks. Affleck's brief but memorable scenes convey the atmosphere of wartime suspicion and the tension between scientific openness and national security demands. Rami Malek plays David Hill, the metallurgical laboratory physicist whose later testimony against Strauss becomes a pivotal moment in the Senate hearings. Malek's understated delivery in that sequence carries significant narrative force. Kenneth Branagh portrays Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist and Oppenheimer's intellectual idol. Branagh's scenes emphasize mentorship, moral reflection, and the international character of the scientific community. Benny Safdie, better known as a director, was cast as Edward Teller, the Hungarian physicist often called the father of the hydrogen bomb. Safdie's portrayal captures Teller's intensity, single-minded focus on thermonuclear weapons, and eventual willingness to testify against Oppenheimer. The casting of a non-traditional leading actor in the role reinforced the film's preference for specificity over conventional star casting. Tom Conti appears as Albert Einstein in several key sequences that bookend the narrative. Conti's physical resemblance and quiet gravity lend weight to the philosophical exchanges between the two physicists. Gary Oldman has a brief but striking appearance as President Harry S. Truman. The scene in which Oppenheimer meets Truman after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is one of the film's most pointed examinations of the gap between scientific responsibility and political power. Dylan Arnold plays Frank Oppenheimer, Robert's younger brother and fellow physicist. David Krumholtz portrays Isidor Isaac Rabi, the Nobel laureate who serves as a moral and scientific sounding board for Oppenheimer. Matthew Modine is Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Jason Clarke takes the role of Roger Robb, the aggressive counsel at the 1954 security hearing. Dane DeHaan plays Kenneth Nichols, Groves' deputy. Alden Ehrenreich appears as a Senate aide who becomes a quiet observer of Strauss's political maneuvering. Tony Goldwyn is Gordon Gray, chairman of the Security Clearance Board. Jefferson Hall portrays Hakon Chevalier, the friend whose conversation with Oppenheimer becomes a central element of the later loyalty investigation. The supporting scientific ensemble is equally dense. Gustav Skarsgård plays Hans Bethe, head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos. Jack Quaid is Richard Feynman, the irreverent young physicist. Josh Peck appears as Kenneth Bainbridge, director of the Trinity test. Devon Bostick is Seth Neddermeyer, advocate of the implosion design. Danny DeFerrari portrays Enrico Fermi. Christopher Denham is Klaus Fuchs, the spy. Oliver Thirlby plays Lily Honig. Alex Wolff is Luis Alvarez. Matthias Schweighöfer appears as Werner Heisenberg. Michael Angarano is Robert Serber. These roles, though often limited in screen time, required actors capable of delivering technical dialogue with conviction and of populating the Los Alamos sequences with a sense of collective intellectual urgency. Papsidera has emphasized that the casting extended beyond principal and supporting actors to the background players. Nolan wanted the scientists and technicians visible in laboratory and meeting scenes to look and feel authentic to the 1940s. Casting calls were held in Santa Fe and Los Alamos itself. A significant percentage of the extras in certain sequences were actual scientists or people with scientific backgrounds. Strict guidelines governed appearance. No modern tattoos that could not be covered. No dyed hair, outside period styles, body types that avoided contemporary gym-honed physiques, and hairstyles consistent with the era. Women were often required to arrive with rollers in their hair so that period styles could be set quickly. The goal was not merely visual accuracy but an atmosphere in which the principal actors could feel surrounded by people who belonged in that historical moment. Nolan's long-standing collaboration with Papsidera meant that many casting decisions could be made with unusual speed and mutual understanding. Once the major roles were set, the process of filling the dozens of smaller but essential parts proceeded with an eye toward both historical likeness and the ability to handle dense, rapid fire dialogue. The film's structure, cutting between color sequences, focused on Oppenheimer's subjective experience and black and white sequences centered on Strauss's political world, also influenced casting. Actors appearing primarily in the black and white sections needed to register strongly in a more austere visual register, while those in the color sections had to sustain the intensity of Oppenheimer's internal journey. Physical transformation was not limited to Murphy. Several actors adjusted their appearance to approximate historical photographs. Conti's Einstein required careful aging and makeup work. Safdie's Teller involved distinctive hair and facial styling. The overall effect is an ensemble that rarely feels like a collection of contemporary celebrities playing dress up. Instead, the faces on screen consistently evoke the archival images of the Manhattan Project and the subsequent political battles. The casting also reflects Nolan's interest in working with actors across different stages of their careers and from different performance traditions. Established stars such as Damon, Downey, Blunt, and Branagh share the frame with character actors, emerging talents, and performers better known for directing or for work outside mainstream Hollywood. This mixture creates a texture in which no single performer dominates every scene. Instead, attention shifts fluidly among a large group of distinct individuals, mirroring the collaborative and often contentious nature of the historical events themselves. Papsidera has spoken of the particular challenge of casting a film that functions simultaneously as a scientific procedural, a political thriller, a domestic drama, and a meditation on moral responsibility. Each role had to serve multiple narrative functions. Groves is both military administrator and eventual witness. Strauss is both bureaucratic rival and framing device. Tatlock is both romantic partner and security liability. Teller is both scientific colleague and eventual antagonist. The actors chosen for these parts needed the range to embody those shifting functions without losing the specificity of the historical person. The decision to cast Murphy in the lead after years of supporting roles in Nolan's films also carried symbolic weight. It signaled a shift from ensemble-driven narratives in which Murphy was one element among many to a project in which his performance would be the gravitational center. The surrounding cast was then assembled to orbit that center while remaining fully realized in their own right. The result is a film in which even brief appearances, Oldman's Truman, Conti's Einstein, Malek's Hill register with unusual force because the actors bring established craft and carefully chosen physical presence to roles that could easily have been underwritten. In practical terms, the casting process unfolded over several months in late 2021 and early 2022. Murphy was announced first. Subsequent announcements of Blunt, Damon, Downey, Pugh, and others generated significant public interest and helped position the film as a major event. Yet, the quieter work of filling the scientific and bureaucratic ranks continued in parallel, with Papsidera and his team searching for faces that would not only look correct but also possess the intelligence and focus required to make complex technical and political dialogue feel lived in rather than recited. The emphasis on historical resemblance extended to smaller details. Actors were encouraged to study photographs, recordings, and written accounts of their characters. Some, such as those playing the more obscure scientists, had limited archival material and therefore relied more heavily on the script and on consultation with the production's historical advisors. Others, playing figures as well documented as Einstein or Truman, had to navigate the challenge of well-known public images while still creating a performance that served the film's specific dramatic needs. The ensemble nature of the casting also served the film's thematic concerns. The Manhattan Project was a vast collaborative enterprise involving thousands of people. The security hearing and Senate proceedings were similarly populated by lawyers, politicians, scientists, and witnesses. By filling the frame with a large number of distinct recognizable performers rather than relying on anonymous background players for the key supporting roles, the film visually reinforces the idea that history is made by networks of individuals, each with their own motives, limitations, and capacities for both insight and error. Papsidera's approach has been consistent across his work with Nolan. A preference for actors who can disappear into character, a willingness to look beyond the most obvious commercial choices, and a commitment to building ensembles that feel organic rather than constructed solely for marketing purposes. In Oppenheimer, those principles were applied to an unusually large canvas. The resulting cast is one of the most densely packed in recent mainstream cinema, yet it rarely feels overcrowded because each performer is given a clear function within the narrative architecture. The physical and intellectual demands placed on the actors were considerable. Many scenes involve rapid exchanges of scientific concepts, political argumentation, or personal confrontation. The IMAX format in which much of the film was shot requires a particular kind of facial and bodily control. Small shifts in expression are magnified. Actors had to sustain intensity across long takes while remaining precise in their delivery of period specific language and technical terminology. The casting therefore prioritized performers with proven ability to handle complex material under demanding technical conditions. In the end, the casting of Oppenheimer stands as a comprehensive exercise in matching contemporary performers to historical figures while simultaneously constructing a cinematic ensemble capable of carrying a 3-hour narrative of unusual structural and thematic ambition. From Murphy's transformative lead performance to the carefully chosen supporting players and the meticulously selected background artists, every level of the cast was shaped by the dual imperatives of historical fidelity and dramatic effectiveness. The process, guided by Nolan's vision and executed by Papsidera's long experience, produced a gallery of faces that both evoke the archival record and generate the emotional and intellectual voltage required by the story. Production development and pre production, the road to Oppenheimer reaching movie screens was a long and winding one, stretching back well over a decade before Christopher Nolan ever got involved. Director Sam Mendes was actually the first filmmaker to show real interest in turning Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin's Pulitzer winning 2005 biography American Prometheus into a movie. When that project didn't pan out, the book's film rights bounced between different filmmakers for the next 15 years, and the authors themselves grew increasingly doubtful that a movie would ever actually get made. Oliver Stone was one of the directors who was offered a shot at directing it, but he turned it down, admitting he just couldn't figure out how to capture the essence of the story. In 2015, producer David Vargo picked up the option on the book and went through several scripts, rejecting each one. Then, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Vargo flew out to Hollywood to sit down with actor James Woods. That meeting led to another meeting, this time with Charles Rowan, a longtime producer of Christopher Nolan's films. Rowan ended up passing a copy of the book along to Nolan, and that's really where the ball started rolling. Both Vargo and Woods are credited as executive producers on the finished film. Interestingly, Woods later said he was asked to stay out of the promotional spotlight for the movie since his outspoken political opinions were seen as a potential risk to the film's box office performance and its award scenes and chances. Christopher Nolan had actually wanted to make a film about Oppenheimer for a long time, even before he'd read American Prometheus. Back in 2019, near the tail end of shooting his sci-fi thriller Tenet, star Robert Pattinson handed Nolan a book collecting Oppenheimer speeches. Nolan later explained that reading those speeches showed him a man grappling with the weight of what he had done and what it meant. He wanted his film to show what it must have felt like to actually be Oppenheimer living through those moments, a contrast to Tenet, which deals with the threat of a weapon of mass destruction through the lens of time travel. Around the same time, in December 2020, Warner Bros. Pictures, the studio that had partnered with Nolan on every one of his films going back to Insomnia in 2002, announced that all of its 2021 releases would hit theaters and HBO Max on the very same day, citing the toll the pandemic was taking on the movie business. Nolan, who had always been a fierce defender of the traditional theatrical experience, was furious about the decision. By January 2021, rumors were already swirling that Nolan's next project might be the first of his career not financed or distributed by Warner Bros. Sure enough, by the middle of that year, Nolan had officially parted ways with the studio and started shopping his new idea around to other companies. He had previously backed Warner Brothers' choice to give Wonder Woman 1984 a simultaneous release in 2020, feeling that situation had been handled the right way, but he was upset that he'd been shut out of any conversations about the postponed release of Tenet by September 2021. Word got out that Nolan would be writing and directing a biographical film centered on Oppenheimer's role in the Manhattan Project, with Cillian Murphy already in talks to headline it. Because his relationship with Warner Brothers had soured, Nolan took meetings with a handful of other studios, including Sony, Universal, Paramount, and Apple. According to people familiar with the process, Paramount was crossed off the list fairly early on, mostly because the studio had just replaced CEO and chairman Jim Janopoulos with Brian Robbins, who was known for pushing a heavier streaming first strategy. In the end, Nolan went with Universal, largely because of his prior working relationship with Donna Langley, the chairwoman and chief content officer at NBC Universal. The two had previously teamed up unsuccessfully, trying to get a film adaptation of the British TV series The Prisoner off the ground. Langley was fully on board with Nolan's belief in traditional theatrical releases, and Universal agreed to both finance and distribute Oppenheimer, with filming targeted to begin sometime in the first few months of 2022. Universal also signed off on a set of terms that Nolan wanted, including a $100 million production budget, a marketing budget of equal size, an exclusive theatrical window of 90 to 120 days before the film could move to other platforms, a cut of 20% of the film's first dollar gross, and a guarantee that the studio wouldn't release another new film in the 3 weeks before or after Oppenheimer's opening. Nolan's fascination with Oppenheimer actually traces back to his youth, when he first heard the line, "How can I save my little boy from Oppenheimer's deadly toy?" in the 1985 Sting song Russians. He also grew up with a real personal fear of nuclear war, having lived through the era of the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the anti-nuclear demonstrations at RF Greenham Common in England. He's talked about how that fear of nuclear catastrophe never really disappeared, even if it ebbed and flowed with the times, and he felt Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine brought a fresh wave of that old nuclear anxiety back to the surface. Interestingly, Nolan had also written an unproduced script for a Howard Hughes biopic around the same period that Martin Scorsese was making The Aviator, and that earlier writing experience gave him some useful groundwork for tackling a script based on someone's real life. Emily Blunt, who would go on to play Kitty Oppenheimer, later described the script as deeply emotional, saying Nolan had essentially snuck a biopic inside the shell of a thriller. By September 2021, both Rowan and Nolan had reached out to authors Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin to talk through the script. During his first sit-down with Nolan, Bird discovered that Nolan had already written a full-spec script, though Nolan didn't actually show it to either author at that point. Oppenheimer turned out to be the first script Nolan ever wrote in the first person, since he wanted the whole story told through Oppenheimer's own point of view. He described the film's overall texture as being about how one person's private life collides with historical events and global politics. Framing it as something of a cautionary tale, he started writing the script once Tenet wrapped and finished a full draft in just a few months, even though the idea of making an Oppenheimer film had actually been sitting in the back of his mind for more than 20 years. One of the biggest storytelling threads running through the film is Oppenheimer's delayed reaction to the long-term fallout of his own choices. Nolan wanted to dig into how people often don't fully confront the worst consequences of what they've done right when it happens. That reckoning tends to come later. To help tell the story from two different angles, he decided to shoot some scenes in color and others in black and white. The color scenes represent Oppenheimer's own subjective experience, while the black and white scenes offer a more detached, objective view of events as seen through other characters. Wanting the film to feel as personal and internal as possible, the team also built in visual sequences meant to represent Oppenheimer's own mental images of the quantum world and waves of energy. Nolan has said that even though Oppenheimer never publicly apologized for his part in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he genuinely believes the man felt real guilt and he wanted that guilt to come through in the performance. And the writing, Nolan has described Oppenheimer as maybe the most contradictory and complicated character he's ever put on screen. Quite a statement, he noted, given that he'd already made 3 Batman films. He started by searching for a thread that could tie together the quantum world, the vibration of energy, and Oppenheimer's own personal path, and he wanted to be honest about the harder parts of Oppenheimer's life, especially his romantic relationships. That's part of why Nolan chose to depict Oppenheimer's affair with Jean Tatlock so directly. He also wanted to explore how much Tatlock as a communist ended up shaping the rest of Oppenheimer's life and ultimately his downfall. On top of that, Nolan wanted to dig into the complicated relationship between Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss, the former head of the US Atomic Energy Commission, drawing inspiration from the dynamic between Mozart and Salieri, as portrayed in the 1984 film Amadeus. Another pivotal scene in the film is the moment President Harry Truman calls Oppenheimer a crybaby. Nolan wanted that scene told entirely from Oppenheimer's point of view, describing it as a massive moment of disillusionment, a huge turning point in how Oppenheimer tried to reckon with the consequence of everything he'd taken part in, and also a shift in how the audience perceives Oppenheimer's own sense of reality. Nolan also wanted a rapid tonal shift right after the depiction of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, aiming to go from the highest emotional peak straight down to the lowest possible point in the shortest amount of screen time he could manage. As for the ending, Nolan intentionally left it open to interpretation, steering away from anything too preachy or message driven, though he did want to leave the audience with a strong, unsettling sense of what was still to come. Oppenheimer marked the 6th time Nolan had worked with Cillian Murphy, but the very first time Murphy had taken the lead role in one of his films. To get ready for the part, Murphy read heavily on Oppenheimer's life and drew some inspiration from David Bowie's look in the 1970s. Nolan called Murphy up personally to offer him the role, and Murphy jumped at the chance, thrilled to finally headline a Nolan picture. Afterward, Nolan flew out to Dublin to meet him in person, and Murphy read through the script right there in Nolan's hotel room. Murphy dropped a significant undisclosed amount of weight to better match Oppenheimer's famously gaunt frame. Nolan also arranged a phone call between Murphy and Nobel laureate physicist Kip Thorne, who had worked with Nolan before on Interstellar. As a young graduate student, Thorne had actually sat in on some of Oppenheimer's real seminars, and he shared with Murphy what it was like watching Oppenheimer's knack for guiding tough scientific discussions. The casting process itself was kept extremely secretive, so much so that some actors didn't even know which historical figure they'd be playing until after they'd already signed their contracts. Robert Downey Jr., Matt Damon, and Emily Blunt all agreed to take pay cuts to be part of the project, each earning around $4 million instead of their typical $20 million upfront salary. Downey went to Nolan's house to read the script, which was printed on red paper in black ink, and he later called Oppenheimer the best film he's ever appeared in. Interestingly, Downey had actually met with Nolan years earlier for the role of Jonathan Crane, aka Scarecrow in Batman Begins, but Nolan didn't think he was right for that part, which ultimately went to Murphy instead. Blunt met with Nolan in Los Angeles, and when she was offered the role of Kitty Oppenheimer, she said yes immediately, even calling up Murphy beforehand to get a sense of what it would be like working with Nolan. Matt Damon, who had appeared in Nolan's Interstellar, was asked to play General Leslie Groves. At the time, Damon was on a break from acting while working through relationship issues with his wife in couples therapy, but he'd made one exception to that break. If Nolan ever offered him a role, he'd take it. Nolan cast writer-director Benny Safdie as physicist Edward Teller after chatting with director Paul Thomas Anderson about his experience directing Safdie in Licorice Pizza. As it happens, Safdie had actually worked alongside a real nuclear physicist at Columbia University back in high school. Oppenheimer also holds the distinction of being the first Nolan film since Insomnia not to feature Michael Caine in some capacity. Glenn Powell auditioned for a role that ultimately went to Josh Hartnett. To play Harry Truman, Nolan turned to his frequent collaborator Gary Oldman, who was on a break from filming the Apple TV Plus series Slow Horses. Oldman explained he was contractually barred from cutting his hair, so Nolan either had to let him wear a wig and prosthetic cap or cast someone else. Nolan went with the wig and cap. Pre production got underway by January 2022 out in New Mexico, where a 2 day casting call was held in Santa Fe and Los Alamos to find local residents willing to play background roles as townsfolk, soldiers, and scientists. A second casting call followed in February. Looking back at how secretive and layered the whole development process was, it's worth remembering just how many hands this project passed through before it ever reached a soundstage. What started as Sam Mendes' early curiosity about American Prometheus turned into more than a decade and a half of stalled options, rejected drafts, and disillusioned authors before a chance chain of introductions. Wargo to Woods, Woods to Rowan, Rowan to Nolan finally got the right person holding the right book at the right time. And even once Nolan was attached, the project still had to survive a messy split from Warner Bros., a bidding process among several major studios, and a fairly unusual set of financial demands before it could actually move into pre production. That whole backstory helps explain why the finished film feels like such a personal passion project for Nolan rather than a standard studio assignment. By the time cameras rolled, he had been thinking about Oppenheimer in one form or another for the better part of 2 decades. Filming principal photography kicked off on February 20, 2022 at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico with Hoyt van Hoytema behind the camera as cinematographer. The shoot lasted 57 days total. Originally, the production had planned for roughly 85 days of filming, but during pre production, it became obvious the film couldn't be completed for $100 million across that many days while shooting all over the country. To make the budget work while still allowing for location shoots in California and New Jersey, along with the construction of detailed, historically accurate sets in New Mexico, Nolan compressed the schedule down from 85 days to 57. Murphy, who appears in nearly every single scene of the finished film, described the pace of the shoot as absolutely relentless. Gary Oldman was only on set for a single day in May, filming just one scene that amounted to a page and a half of script. The production had originally planned to shoot the Oval Office scenes at the Nixon Presidential Library, but that location fell through just a week before filming was set to begin. Since Oldman's schedule couldn't be moved, the production design team ended up redressing the old Oval Office set that had been built for the HBO series Veep, which by that point had reportedly fallen into pretty rough shape. In one particularly personal touch, Nolan cast his own eldest daughter, Flora, in a scene depicting a young woman disintegrating in a nuclear blast, one of Oppenheimer's visions in the film. Nolan has said he wanted that moment to convey the idea that once you unleash the ultimate destructive power, it ends up threatening the people closest to you as well. For the visual look of the film, the team used a mix of IMAX 65mm and 65mm large format film stock. It's also the first movie ever to shoot portions on IMAX black and white film, a stock that Kodak developed and Photochem processed specifically for this production. Van Hoytema shot with 50mm and 80mm Hasselblad lenses on IMAX MKV and IMAX 9802 cameras, while scenes captured on Panavision Panaflex System 65 studio cameras used Panavision Sphero 65 and System 65 lenses. The production also had Panavision build a custom probe lens so the filmmakers could use IMAX cameras for macro and micro photography, allowing them to capture miniature effects up close. Some miniatures were shot with IMAX cameras running at 48 frames per second, while ones that needed to be captured at higher speeds were filmed on Super 35mm stock using an Arriflex 435 ES camera running at 150 frames per second. In the second week of April, the production traveled to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey to shoot on location. Additional filming took place in California, mostly around the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, while scenes actually set within the city of Berkeley itself were filmed in Pasadena. During a research trip back in 2021, Nolan discovered that the real town of Los Alamos had changed so much since the 1940s that it simply wasn't usable for exterior shots. Its modern main street even has a Starbucks on it now. So instead, The production built its own version of 1940s era Los Alamos on a similar plateau at Ghost Ranch. Constructing that set took 3 whole months, even though it was only used for 6 days of actual shooting. The plan was to shoot all the exterior footage on the custom built Ghost Ranch set, then film the interior scenes on location inside genuine historic buildings in the real town of Los Alamos. Interior filming in the actual town of Los Alamos began on March 8, 2022. Since many scenes in the film take place inside academic lecture halls, the team decided it wasn't worth the time or money to rebuild those spaces as sets at Ghost Ranch and instead filmed them inside a historic Women's Army Corps dormitory located in Los Alamos. Some scenes were even filmed inside Oppenheimer's actual restored cabin in Los Alamos. Author Kai Bird visited the set during filming and came away impressed by Murphy's performance. The scenes meant to represent a New York hotel were actually filmed inside Albuquerque's old post office building, while the Washington, D.C. scenes were shot inside state government buildings in Santa Fe. Although a lot of the press coverage around the film's release gave the impression that most of it was filmed in New Mexico, the official making of book, Unleashing Oppenheimer, later revealed that a number of the film's key scenes were actually shot within the Los Angeles studio zone. Early in the schedule, 3 days were set aside for filming at UCLA's Kerkhoff Hall, which doubled for both the Cambridge and Göttingen sequences. The Millennium Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles played several different roles throughout the film. It stood in for the Mark Hopkins Hotel during one of Oppenheimer's meetings with Tatlock, for the Plaza Hotel during Strauss's 1949 birthday celebration, and for an unnamed Washington, D.C. hotel where Szilard and Hill tried to convince Oppenheimer to sign a petition opposing the bomb's use on Japan. Oppenheimer's security hearing scenes were filmed in Alhambra, California, inside a rundown, disused office building that had once served as the manufacturing headquarters for the petrochemical company C.F. Braun & Co. The scene depicting the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance was actually shot on May 19, 2022, which was the production's final day filming in Alhambra. To recreate the Trinity nuclear test, the production actually used real explosives rather than computer-generated effects. When word of this first spread online, plenty of fans, well aware of Nolan's well-known love of practical in-camera effects, genuinely wondered if he had somehow set off an actual atomic bomb. Nolan later said he found that reaction both flattering and more than a little unsettling. The production team did manage to get government permission to film at White Sands Missile Range, but only during extremely inconvenient hours, so they ultimately opted to shoot the sequence elsewhere in the New Mexico desert instead. The Trinity test scenes were filmed in Belen, New Mexico, with Murphy himself climbing a 100-foot steel tower, a faithful replica of the original Manhattan Project test site in rough weather conditions. A specially engineered set used gasoline, propane, aluminum powder, and magnesium to produce the explosive visual effect. Even though the team relied on miniatures for these practical effects, special effects supervisor Scott R. Fisher referred to them as bigatures, since his team tried to build the models as physically large as they could manage, and they used forced perspective techniques to make the models appear even bigger than their actual size. The visualizations showing interactions between atoms, molecules, and energy waves, along with depictions of stars, black holes, and supernovas, were also achieved using practical in-camera methods rather than digital effects. Nolan has claimed the finished film contains no computer-generated effects at all, describing the goal as capturing genuinely real-world imagery on camera. The final stretch of principal photography saw Nolan and Van Hoytema travel to Europe to capture establishing shots for the earlier chapters of Oppenheimer's life. Rather than actually filming anywhere on the University of Cambridge campus, Van Hoytema simply set up a camera across the river to get the shot he needed. Filming officially wrapped in May 2022, taken all together, the shoot ended up being a real patchwork of locations standing in for one another. New Mexico towns doubling as other New Mexico towns from a different decade, Los Angeles buildings pretending to be East Coast hotels, a British university campus glimpsed only from across a river. That kind of resourceful location work is fairly typical for a big studio production working under real budget pressure, But it's a little surprising given how much of the film's marketing leaned into the idea of authentic on the ground shooting in the actual desert landscapes where the historical events took place. In practice, the production balanced genuine boots on the ground location shooting in New Mexico with a good deal of clever substitution work back in Los Angeles, all in service of keeping the compressed 57-day schedule on track without blowing past the agreed upon budget. Post production editing on the film was handled by Jennifer Lime, who had previously cut Tenet for Nolan as well. While reviewing footage during the editing process, Nolan and Lime did what they called character passes, going back through to make sure every character was getting properly represented on screen. Since the film moves at a notably faster clip than most traditional big budget movies, visual effects work was handled by Dean Edgy, marking their eighth collaboration with Nolan overall. The studio produced more than 100 VFX shots built from over 400 practically shot elements. Andrew Jackson served as the visual effects supervisor on the project, and he said that most of the effects work in the film was designed to be essentially invisible, built around in camera practical effects created right there on set. Digital compositing techniques were used for the Trinity test sequence, specifically layering multiple angles of the explosion together since it had been filmed from several different viewpoints at once. In total, 160 visual effects artists worked on the film, though 134 of them ended up going uncredited. Steven Spielberg was reportedly the very first person outside the production to see the finished cut, catching a private screening of the first 70mm print. Nolan later recalled that Spielberg said some kind things about the film, but that what really struck Nolan was simply watching Spielberg watch it. He said it was something close to irresistible, even though he technically wasn't supposed to be in the room with him at the time. That anecdote fits with the broader picture of how tightly controlled and low key the post production phase seems to have been. Given the sensitivity of the subject matter and the highly technical nature of the practical effects work, the team clearly put a lot of care into making sure the film's biggest set pieces, especially the Trinity test sequence, landed exactly the way Nolan intended once picture editing and sound design were locked. The choice to bring in Dineji for a comparatively light VFX pass focused mostly on enhancing practically shot elements rather than building sequences from scratch, is consistent with Nolan's long-standing preference for grounding even his most spectacular imagery in something that was actually filmed on a real set in front of a real camera. Music: Ludwig Göransson composed the score for Oppenheimer, continuing his collaboration with Nolan after previously scoring Tenet. Göransson's music first appeared publicly in a trailer released on May 8, 2023, and it later featured prominently in Universal's exclusive 5-minute opening look preview released on July 13. Nolan reportedly encouraged Göransson to build Oppenheimer's central musical theme around a solo violin, and Göransson has talked about how that instrument could shift almost instantly from the most tender romantic tone imaginable to something jagged, neurotic, and full of dread. The score plays an enormous role throughout the film, with music running through almost the entire runtime. By Goransson's own estimate, music plays continuously for at least 2.5 hours of the movie, accounting for something like 83% of its total length, an unusually high proportion even by the standards of a heavily scored blockbuster. That near constant presence of music is part of what gives Oppenheimer its distinctive, almost breathless momentum, especially given how much of the film is built around conversations, hearings, and lecture hall scenes rather than traditional action sequences. Rather than treating the score as something that swells in only during big emotional beats, Göransson and Nolan appear to have used the music almost like a second narration track, running underneath the dialogue to keep tension humming along, even through scenes that are on paper just people sitting in rooms talking. The solo violin approach that Nolan specifically requested becomes something of a recurring signature for Oppenheimer himself, following him from his most hopeful, idealistic moments as a young academic all the way through the darker, more paranoid stretches of the story. Released theatrical Oppenheimer's teaser trailer dropped on July 28, 2022, built around a live countdown clock ticking toward 5:29 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time on July 16, 2023, the 78th anniversary of the very first detonation of an atomic weapon at the Trinity test site. The teaser first played in theaters ahead of screenings of Nope before being uploaded to Universal's social media accounts. Empire magazine praised it as a perfect example of Nolan's signature style, calling it heavy, moody material carrying real emotional weight. In December 2022, two separate trailers debuted ahead of screenings of Avatar. The Way of Water, one exclusive to IMAX theaters, the other shown everywhere else, with the wider version eventually posted online. Then in May 2023, an official full-length trailer premiered during preview screenings of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, before being released publicly on May 8 alongside the film's theatrical release poster. Oppenheimer had its world premiere at Le Grand Rex in Paris on July 11, 2023, followed by the British premiere at the Odeon Lux Leicester Square in London on July 13, and finally the American premiere at the AMC Lincoln Square 13 in New York City on July 17. Both the London and New York premieres were affected by the ongoing SAG-AFTRA actors strike. Some cast members left the London event early, and Universal ended up cancelling the red carpet portion of the New York premiere altogether. SAG-AFTRA President Fran Drescher later claimed the studios had misled the union into agreeing to a 12-day extension of negotiations specifically so they could keep promoting big summer releases like Oppenheimer. The film opened in theaters on July 21, 2023, distributed by Universal Pictures. Beyond standard digital cinema screens, it also played in a range of specialty film formats, including roughly 30 IMAX 70mm prints, about 113 standard 70mm prints, and around 80 prints on 35mm film. The film happened to open on exactly the same day as Barbie, the fantasy comedy directed by Greta Gerwig based on Mattel's Barbie toy line and distributed by Warner Brothers. Plenty of people speculated that Warner Brothers deliberately scheduled Barbie against Oppenheimer as a kind of payback for Nolan leaving the studio to work with Universal instead. Because the two films were such a wild tonal mismatch, social media quickly filled up with memes contrasting the two very different audiences they seemed to be chasing, along with jokes about how the perfect move was actually to watch both as a double feature in the same day. That whole cultural moment picked up the nickname Barbenheimer and was later described by commentators as a clever bit of counter-programming during what was otherwise shaping up to be a rough summer for the movie business. Cillian Murphy himself got behind the trend, encouraging people to go see both films on the same day, saying that if they were both good movies, that could only be a win for cinema as a whole. Back in March 2022, Universal had already paused the release of all its titles in Russia, joining most of the other major American studios in a boycott following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Oppenheimer itself was also formally banned by Russia's Ministry of Culture, which refused to license the film, claiming it didn't align with the country's stated goal of preserving traditional Russian spiritual values. In Japan, the film didn't open until a full 8 months after its initial worldwide release. Variety pointed out that the film's subject matter carried an especially delicate reputation there, given the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A spokesperson for Universal said at the time that release plans simply hadn't been finalized everywhere yet, and noted that American films are often released in Japan a few months behind their initial theatrical debut elsewhere. In December 2023, the independent Japanese distributor Bitters End announced it would handle the film's 2024 theatrical release in Japan, after Universal's usual Japanese distribution partner, Toho Towa, chose to pass on releasing it. The film finally opened in Japan on March 29, 2024 through Bitters End, and over its first 3 days there, it ranked as the highest grossing foreign film in the country, pulling in 379.3 million yen, or roughly $2.5 million. In the United States, the Motion Picture Association gave Oppenheimer an R rating, citing some sexual content, nudity, and language, marking Nolan's first R-rated film since Insomnia back in 2002. In Australia, the film received an MA 15 plus classification for strong sexual content and a suicide scene. In the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Classification handed it a 15 certificate for strong language and sexual content, meaning no one under 15 could be legally admitted. In several countries, including some in the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, Universal distributed a version of the film in which Florence Pugh's nude scenes were digitally altered to add a computer generated black dress. In India specifically, Oppenheimer was released with all nudity, sexual content, and cigarette smoking scenes censored, which allowed it to earn a UCA certificate from the Central Board of Film Certification while still keeping its original runtime intact. The audio for the scene in which Jean Tatlock has Oppenheimer read aloud from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, the famous line, I am become death, destroyer of worlds, was left completely untouched, however. According to reporting from NDTV, India's Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Anurag Thakur, questioned how the censor board had approved the film with that scene intact given its context and called for the scene to be removed. Hindu nationalist groups also voiced anger over the scene and demanded it be cut. Journalist Uday Mahorkar went so far as to write an open letter to Nolan describing the scene as a direct affront to the religious beliefs of a billion Hindus and calling for its removal from every version of the film released anywhere in the world. On the other side of the debate, actor Nitish Bharadwaj told the Times of India that the scene needed to be understood through the lens of Oppenheimer's own state of mind, arguing that a scientist's thoughts are consumed by his creation at all times and that the physical act shown was simply an incidental, almost mechanical moment layered on top of that deeper preoccupation. Taken as a whole, the film's theatrical rollout ended up being one of the more unusual global release stories in recent memory, not because of anything to do with the movie's box office trajectory, but because of just how differently it was received, censored, and debated from one country to the next. A 3 hour, largely dialogue driven historical drama about a physicist doesn't typically generate this kind of worldwide cultural conversation. Yet, between the Barbenheimer phenomenon in North America, the Russian government ban, the prolonged wait for a Japanese release, and the censorship debate in India, Oppenheimer became something of a genuine global talking point well beyond the usual circle of critics and awards voters. Home media Oppenheimer arrived on Ultra HD Blu-ray, Standard Blu-ray, and DVD alongside digital release on November 21, 2023. Both the Ultra HD and Standard Blu-ray editions sold out within days of hitting shelves, prompting Universal to work on restocking supply ahead of the holiday shopping season. During the promotional push for the home release, Nolan was especially vocal about the importance of maintaining physical media collections, arguing that letting films exist purely in digital form or on streaming platforms hands companies too much control and puts long-term film preservation at real risk. The film became available for streaming in the United States exclusively through Peacock and in Canada through Amazon Prime Video, both starting February 16, 2024. More recently, on July 12, 2025, Oppenheimer was added to Netflix in the United Kingdom and Ireland. The strong early sales of the physical Blu-ray and Ultra HD editions were a notable data point in an era when plenty of studios have scaled back their investment in physical media altogether. Given Nolan's long-standing, very public advocacy for film preservation and physical ownership, it's not surprising that he used the home release press cycle as a platform to make that case directly to audiences, framing the choice to buy a physical copy as something bigger than just a format preference, more like a small act of pushing back against the idea that a film's long-term availability should be left entirely in the hands of streaming platforms. Reception box office Oppenheimer ended up grossing $330.1 million across the United States and Canada and another $646.7 million internationally, adding up to a worldwide total of $976.8 million. Of that total, roughly $190 million came from IMAX screens alone. That box office haul makes it the third highest grossing R-rated film of all time, trailing only behind Joker from 2019 and Deadpool and Wolverine from 2024. By September 2023, Oppenheimer had also become the highest grossing biographical film ever made, overtaking Bohemian Rhapsody, which had held that record since 2018. By August 2023, Oppenheimer had become the highest grossing film in history to never actually claim the number one spot at the domestic weekend box office. Though in its sixth weekend in theaters, it did top the worldwide box office chart outright. pulling in $38.12 million and surpassing Barbie globally for the first time. It also holds the record as the highest grossing World War II related film ever, surpassing Dunkirk, another Nolan film from 2017. On top of that, Oppenheimer became one of the five highest grossing IMAX releases of all time, earning $183 million through IMAX screens alone, which works out to roughly 20% of its total worldwide gross. More than $17 million of that came from just the 30 screens showing the special IMAX 70mm prints. Given how well those IMAX 70mm engagements were selling out during the initial run, the film was booked for a release in IMAX theaters starting November 3, including 6 IMAX 70mm prints. Deadline Hollywood later calculated the film's net profit at $201.9 million null once every expense and revenue stream was factored in. In the US and Canada, Oppenheimer opened the same weekend as Barbie, kicking off the Barbenheimer phenomenon. In the lead up to release, AMC Theaters reported that more than 40,000 AMC Stubs members had already pre-booked tickets to see both films on the same day. Oppenheimer brought in $33 million on its opening day, including $10.5 million from Thursday night preview screenings, and went on to debut with an $82.5 million opening weekend. That put it in second place behind Barbie, but it still marked one of the strongest opening weekends ever recorded for an R-rated drama. The opening weekend audience skewed 64% male, with 33% falling between the ages of 18 and 34. The Barbenheimer craze got plenty of credit for driving ticket sales, with the two films together accounting for 79% of all tickets sold that weekend. 27% of that share went specifically to Oppenheimer, adding up to a combined 18.5 million moviegoers. That opening also stands as Nolan's best ever debut for an original non-franchise film, ranking as the top opening of his career outside of the final two entries in his Dark Knight trilogy. It also landed as the third highest opening weekend ever for a biographical film, behind only The Passion of the Christ in 2004 and American Sniper in 2014. Oppenheimer pulled in $46.2 million in its second weekend, a drop of 44%, staying in second place behind Barbie. The film then made $28.7 million in its third weekend, slipping to third place behind both Barbie and the new release Meg 2: The Trench. On August 16, Oppenheimer overtook Sing from 2016 to become the highest grossing film in history to never hit number one at the box office. During its fourth weekend, it earned $18.8 million, a 35% drop, which was enough to push it back up to second place. Over its fifth and sixth weekends, the film made $10.7 million and $9 million respectively, drops of 43% and 16%, landing in third and then fourth place while crossing the $300 million mark domestically during that sixth weekend. Following its haul of 13 Oscar nominations, the film's theater count actually expanded from 1,008 to 2,262 screens in its 28th week of release, generating $1 million that weekend, a 284% jump from the week before. In Japan, where Oppenheimer opened on March 29, 2024, the release had already stirred up controversy beforehand with Warner Brothers, issuing an apology after criticism that the Barbenheimer trend had come across as insensitive given Japan's history with the atomic bombings. Despite that controversy, the film still performed solidly there, grossing $5 million and landing in third place at the Japanese box office during its opening weekend. Reactions from Japanese audiences were genuinely mixed. Some theaters posted content warnings ahead of screenings. A number of people from Hiroshima who saw the film reported feeling real discomfort and distress while watching it. One major point of debate centered on the film's decision not to visually depict the bombing of Japan itself. Some viewers praised that choice, while others felt it downplayed or even glorified the bombing by leaving it out. Takashi Hiraoka, a former mayor of Hiroshima, reportedly felt the horror of nuclear weapons hadn't been portrayed strongly enough in the film. Some viewers felt Oppenheimer himself came across as glorified for his role in creating the bomb, while others saw him as a man who was also a victim of his own circumstances, someone who clearly suffered because of it. Masao Tomonaga, who personally survived one of the atomic bombings, described the film as ultimately anti-nuclear in spirit and said he was disappointed there was no scene depicting the bombing in Japan itself. though he was satisfied with how the film portrayed Oppenheimer's distress in the aftermath. One Hiroshima resident was reported as encouraging more people to see the film, while another encouraged fewer people to watch it. Speaking about the film's success in Japan, Akira Mizuta Lipit, Vice Dean of Faculty at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, noted in a May 2024 piece for Deadline Hollywood that earlier films about Japan, some well regarded, others criticized as offensive or ignorant, had nonetheless often done well at the Japanese box office, pointing to how movies like Pearl Harbor and The Last Samurai had been warmly received by Japanese audiences, while something like Memoirs of a Geisha had a noticeably cooler reception. Outside the US and Canada, Oppenheimer grossed $98 million dollars in its opening weekend. The following weekend, it earned $77.1 million, dollars, a drop of 21%, which made it Nolan's highest grossing film ever in 30 different countries, including India, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. In its third international weekend, the film grossed $52.8 million, dollars, a drop of 31%, followed by $32 million dollars in its fourth weekend. It continued to hold up well after that, earning $32 million dollars and then $29 million in its fifth and sixth weekends. As of September 10, 2023, its top performing international markets were the United Kingdom at $75 million, China at $61.6 million, Germany at $51. 9 million, France at 43.1 million, and Australia at 25.9 million dollars. Looking at the overall shape of its box office run, what stands out most is how consistently Oppenheimer performed across an unusually long stretch of weeks, rather than following the more typical pattern of a huge opening followed by a steep, immediate fall off. A 3 hour, R-rated period drama built around courtroom testimony and physics lectures isn't the kind of film that usually holds a theater's top of five for months on end, yet Oppenheimer managed exactly that, helped along by strong word of mouth, the ongoing Barbenheimer conversation, award season momentum once Oscar nominations were announced, and Nolan's dedicated IMAX release strategy, which kept giving audiences a reason to seek the film out in premium large format theaters long after its initial opening weekend had passed. Critical response to Oppenheimer was met with widespread critical acclaim right from the start. Critics singled out the screenplay, the cast performances, and the film's visual craftsmanship for particular praise, and the movie was routinely named among Nolan's very best work, as well as one of the standout films of 2023 as a whole. On the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes, 93% of 513 critic reviews came back positive, with an average score of 8.6 out of 10. The site's critical consensus described the film as another absorbing achievement from Christopher Nolan, elevated by a career-defining performance from Murphy and genuinely stunning visuals. Metacritic, which calculates a weighted average score, gave the film a 90 out of 100 based on 69 reviews, translating to a rating of universal acclaim. Audiences surveyed by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on a scale that runs from A plus down to F, while post-track polling found a 93% overall positive score, with 74% of respondents saying they would definitely recommend the film to others. Richard Roper of the Chicago Sun-Times awarded Oppenheimer a perfect 4 out of 4 stars, calling it a magnificent film and ranking it among the best of the entire 21st century so far. Matthew Jackson of the AV Club called it a masterpiece, describing it as Nolan's finest film to date and one that leaves a lasting impression long after the credits roll. Dan Jolin of Empire magazine called it a masterfully constructed character study, giving special praise to Murphy's performance and Van Hoytema's IMAX cinematography. Writing for Reason magazine, Peter Suderman said the film leaves viewers with a genuine sense of dread about the horrifying possibility of full-scale nuclear conflict, framing the movie as more than just entertainment, closer to an actual warning. Matt Zoller Zeitz, writing for RogerEbert.com, also gave the film a perfect 4-star rating, praising Nolan's storytelling, his handling of Oppenheimer's inner character, and the technical achievements on display, and drew a comparison between the recurring conversation with Einstein in the film and the symbolic role that Rosebud plays in Citizen Kane. Peter Travers called it a monumental achievement and one of the best films you could hope to see anywhere. Karen James of the BBC described it as boldly imaginative and Nolan's most mature work to date, saying it managed to combine the commercially charged action of the Dark Knight trilogy with the more cerebral, puzzle box sensibilities of films like Memento, Inception, and Tenet. IGN critic Siddhant Adlaka gave the film a perfect 10 out of 10, describing it as a 3-hour biopic that somehow plays like a gripping thriller and calling it Nolan's most abstract work yet. Not every review was glowing though. CNN's Brian Lowry, while praising the film's themes and performances, felt Nolan was juggling too many threads at once in a way that ultimately worked against the film. Variety's Owen Gleiberman found the first half of the film mesmerizing, full of a kind of cosmic suspense, but felt that energy started to leak out of the movie after the Trinity test sequence, which he found something of a letdown in its own right. Manola Dargis of the New York Times called it a genuinely impressive achievement on both a formal and conceptual level, praising how well Nolan captured the excitement of intense intellectual debate and comparing the film's fractured narrative structure to a Cubist style portrait, though she found some supporting performances, including Rami Malek's, a bit distracting and felt the black and white sequences occasionally ran long, even if they ultimately served Nolan's broader storytelling goals. In a more mixed review, Odie Henderson of the Boston Globe described the film as visually stunning but emotionally hollow, criticizing the script for turning Oppenheimer into something of a cipher whose inner life gets expressed mostly through flashy cutaways to outer space rather than any real emotional texture. Henderson was also critical of the film's second half, describing it as an endless stretch of courtroom and congressional hearing scenes, and felt that both Florence Pugh and Emily Blunt were underused in roles he considered thinly written. Richard Brody of The New Yorker was even harsher, comparing the film to a glossy History Channel documentary and joking that he'd initially been tempted to call it a movie length Wikipedia article before deciding that comparison was actually unfair to Wikipedia, while praising how the film honored the contributions of American scientists and American industry. Commentator Brett Mason took issue with the film's failure to acknowledge the crucial role that British scientific research and Australian physicist Mark Oliphant played in getting the whole project moving as early as December 1941. Justin Chang, writing for the Los Angeles Times, defended Nolan's choice to show only what Oppenheimer himself could actually witness, arguing that rather than trying to satisfy viewers looking for a complete, tidy account by cutting away to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Nolan instead treated their absence as a deliberate, profound silence, an indictment made through what the film doesn't show rather than what it does. Chang went on to win the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for criticism for that particular piece of writing for IndieWire's annual critics poll, which surveyed 158 critics and journalists from around the world. Oppenheimer placed second on the outlet's overall best film list, earning 69 total mentions and 17 first place votes. Nolan also placed second on the best director list, while his screenplay ranked 8th. Murphy was the highest ranked actor on the best performance list, coming in 4th overall, and Van Hoytema's cinematography topped its respective category outright. Oppenheimer also showed up on more than 410 separate critics' year-end lists for 2023, and it was actually ranked as the number one film of the year on 99 of those lists. The film also drew plenty of praise from other notable filmmakers. Oliver Stone, who had once turned down the chance to direct an Oppenheimer film himself, called the finished movie a classic, adding he never believed something like it could actually get made in the current climate. Paul Schrader called it the best and most important film of the century so far, while Denis Villeneuve simply described it as a masterpiece. Steven Soderbergh praised the film as a real accomplishment, noting he'd read that Nolan considered it the movie he'd been building toward his whole career, and adding he was thrilled to see it become such a massive commercial hit. Spike Lee also called it a great film, though he felt that given its length, it really should have shown what happened to the people of Japan. Japanese director Takashi Yamazaki said that as someone of Japanese heritage, his personal response was that he'd like to eventually make his own film addressing that side of the story. Several other filmmakers, including Avi Rockwell, Joe Dante, Reynaldo Marcus Green, Chad Hartigan, Don Hertzfeldt, Matt Johnson, Rain Allen Miller, James Ponsoldt, and Adam Wingard all named it among their favorite films of 2023. On the more critical side, James Cameron argued the film sidestepped some of its own moral weight, pointing out that Oppenheimer clearly understood the effects of the bomb and felt the film only briefly touched on the human cost, showing one short scene of charred bodies and Oppenheimer's emotional reaction to it before moving on, which Cameron felt ultimately dodged the subject rather than confronting it head on. Korean film critic Yim Jong-sik described Oppenheimer as a portrait of the tragedy created when science and politics collide, noting that Oppenheimer built the bomb to keep the Nazis from getting there first, only for it to end up dropped on Japan with massive loss of life. Yim argued the film coldly illustrates how science loses its innocence once it becomes entangled with the ambitions of a state. In August 2023, Collider ranked Oppenheimer third on its list of the 20 best drama movies of the 2020 so far, praising how Nolan examined the world's fixation with nuclear destruction from the point of view of the man who created it, drawing a connection to mythological ideas about power that, once unleashed, is destined to be used again. In June 2025, IndieWire placed the film at number 54 on its list of the 100 best movies of the 2020s so far, while the New York Times ranked it 65th on its list of the 100 best movies of the 21st century. The following month, Rolling Stone placed it at number 86 on its own list of the 100 best movies of the 21st century. What's striking about the overall critical conversation around Oppenheimer is how rare it was to find a genuinely negative review anywhere in the mix. Even the more skeptical takes, like those from Brody, Henderson, and Lowry, tended to frame their criticism as disappointment relative to a very high bar, rather than treating the film as a failure outright. Most of the pushback centered on a fairly consistent set of concerns: that the film's back half, dominated by hearing room testimony, felt slower or more airless than the propulsive first half, that certain starry supporting performances occasionally distracted from the central story, and that the decision to keep the bombing of Japan entirely off screen, while intentional and defensible, left some viewers wanting a more direct reckoning with the human cost. None of those criticisms, though, seemed to meaningfully dent the film's reputation as one of the defining achievements of Nolan's career, and the sheer volume of top 10 and number 1 placements on end of year critics lists suggests just how rare that level of near universal acclaim actually is for a 3-hour biographical drama. The renewed public attention brought to the Trinity test site and the broader history of nuclear testing helped push the United States Congress to revisit the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, originally passed in 1990 to provide compensation to people affected by Cold War era radiation exposure and nuclear testing, often referred to as downwinders, a group made up largely of members of the Navajo Nation. The U.S. Senate approved amendments meant to extend additional support to people in New Mexico, though the legislation stalled once it reached the House of Representatives, which had not yet debated including it as part of that year's National Defense Bill. Oppenheimer earned a leading 13 nominations at the 96th Academy Awards, making it Nolan's most Oscar-nominated film to date. At the ceremony itself, the film took home 7 awards: Best Picture, Best Director for Nolan, Best Actor for Murphy, Best Supporting Actor for Downey Jr., Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, and Best Original Score. With the exception of composer Göransson, every one of those winners was picking up their first ever Oscar, including Nolan, producers Emma Thomas and Charles Rowan, Downey Jr., and Van Hoytema, all of whom had previously been nominated without a win. Murphy also became the first Irish-born performer ever to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. With its Best Picture win, Oppenheimer became both the highest-grossing and the longest Best Picture winner since 2003's The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. The film also picked up nominations for Best Supporting Actress for Blunt, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Costume Design, Best Makeup and Hairstyling, Best Production Design, and Best Sound beyond the Oscars. The film racked up a long list of other honors. It won 5 Golden Globe Awards at the 81st ceremony, including Best Motion Picture Drama, Best Director for Nolan, Best Actor in a Motion Picture Drama for Murphy, Best Supporting Actor Motion Picture for Downey Jr., and Best Original Score for Göransson. Both the National Board of Review and the American Film Institute named Oppenheimer one of the top 10 films of 2023. The film picked up 13 nominations at the Critics' Choice Movie Awards, winning 8, along with 30 nominations at the British Academy Film Awards, winning 7, 40 nominations at the Saturn Awards, winning 4, and 4 nominations at the Screen Actors Guild Awards, winning 3. Its score also earned 3 nominations at the 66th Annual Grammy Awards, taking together this awards run cemented Oppenheimer's place not just as a commercial success, but as one of the defining prestige films of its era, sweeping an entire awards season the way it did, from the Globes through BAFTA, the Critics' Choice Award, and finally the Academy Awards is something relatively few films managed to pull off so comprehensively, and it reflected just how aligned critics, industry voters, and general audiences all were in their enthusiasm for the film. For Nolan personally, long regarded as one of the most successful and influential directors of his generation, despite a somewhat uneven history with the Academy, the Best Picture and Best Director wins represented a long awaited institutional recognition of a career that had already produced numerous commercial and critical hits. For Murphy, after decades of respected but comparatively lower profile work, the Best Actor win and the milestone of being the first Irish born performer to claim that award marked a major turning point in his career, elevating him to a new tier of recognition. And for Robert Downey Jr., whose career had already included a dramatic comeback narrative years earlier, the Best Supporting Actor win added another significant chapter to that story, this time built on a return to smaller, more character driven work after years spent primarily in blockbuster franchise filmmaking.